Of all the tools made by Kuretake, two things stand out when you start trying to understand how the tools work, and that is the type of ink used in both the markers and the brush pens, both the soft brush pens or felt or spongy tip pens, or the bristled pens, which I tend to refer to as filamented pens. One of the pens we have, one of the inks we have is a dye-based ink, which is not waterproof. So if we add a little bit of water, now when I use these pens in this fashion, I add the water here before, flood it, and then go towards the ink. That creates a really beautiful gradation. You can spread it into the water, and you could even, let's clean that a little bit, push it back into itself. There are lots of ways to work with the dye-based inks. Next we have the pigmented inks. So these inks are not waterproof, but they do bleed if they're still wet. So I'm going to put some down and leave it, but I'm also going to put some down, and while it's still wet, I'm going to add a little bit of water just to saturate the area. Now what I'm doing is I'm pulling the ink out of the water out of the inked area. Let's just leave that for a second. So I'm now wetting the edge of it, and you can see that the ink is not spreading. So this pigmented ink stays fast onto the paper. Now, let's look at the size of the tool. So I've made a rough grid. It's just a series of lines, and those lines are just there to help us. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with the Fude 8 brush pen. Now, the Fude 8 brush pen is a very, very fine nib. It can go from very small and now I'm going to redo this exercise with a little bit of weight. And the same letter with different weights. Notice the slower I write, the bigger I write, the slower I have to write so that the bristles can accommodate spreading wider, to come back again, to make a hairline. And to prove that I've not damaged the tool, remember to press, push, jiggle, twist, turn, and lift to bring the bristles back together. We could go back to that really tiny A. There you go. So that's the Fude 8 brush pen. We can hold the tool on its side to give you a slightly rougher letter if that's what you're looking for. Or we can hold the tool on its vertically to give us a smoother shape if that's the aim for the type of letter you're looking to write. Next exercise, we're going to jump around a little bit across this range. So we're really looking at the bristled brushes to start with. Next exercise is the clean color real brush. So this is it's a filamented tip, which means, for me, it means that it is a synthetic tip. It's a truly exceptional tip because, like the Fude 8, it has the ability to produce small letters as well as large letters. Just a little tip here. if you press, jiggle and press and pull, you should get to just over the width of the base of the brush. So if we put the brush down and we press, that is your brush width. Ideally, you don't want to go any wider than that. You can probably get up to 1.5 times, but if you go beyond that, you're going to cause the bristles to open too much, so the central core of the brush will destabilize. So try not to go beyond that width. Kuretake makes a wonderful range of tools and materials in different sizes. If you want to write bigger, use a bigger tip. So we're going to go from the clean color brush and we can see here that the brush sizes, the tip sizes are different in these two different brushes. So we have a small brush in the 24, which can also go a little bit larger. And a bigger brush in the 22. The next size up in this sort of range would be the Art and Graphic Twin, real brush and fine tip. So this gives us a really fine tip. This is based on a clean colored brush type, but it's made for bigger lettering. Now, if you're aiming for a solid line, you want to take your time. To give the tool the time to deposit the ink. The back side of this tool has a bullet tip, which can be used for outlining, or if you just wanted to tidy up the edges of your letter, you can create a much harder shadow there. There will be differential deposition of ink if this is what you do on the edge of the letter. The next size up are the Cameo brushes. And so these come in 3 sizes. We have a fine, a medium, and a large. Now, what is the essential difference between this and the 22 and the 24? These have much finer tips. And essentially, there's one strand that comes out which funnels the ink down a little bit further along the paper. So let's just put this to the side. So I'm going to use the fine, which is really super fine for such a big tool. And it gives us a nice tall letter that's really thin in aspect. Remember, you don't want to spread the bristles that far. So already this has caused the brush to spread apart. Press, pull, twist, and lift. So that's your fine brush in the Cameo. This is the medium. Which is really super flow. And this is the large. As you can see, I like my gold labels to face up. So this also gives us a really fine line and a really thick stroke. Remember to do that gradually. This is great for large brush lettering. Remember to take your time and keep pressing and pulling and twisting so that you keep the bristles in a nice fine point. I'll get back to the Bimoji range once we've gone through the soft or spongy or felt tip brushes. We have a number of different tips in these felt tip brushes. I tend to call them spongy tips because they tend to be a little bit springier. On the back of the 55, we have a small tip, which is really quite beautiful to write with. Remember, the size of the tip will dictate the size of the letter. So this is probably a good size. Just under a centimeter to write with. It's a hard tip, so try not to press on it. If you press on it, there's a chance that you could damage the tip. I'll come back to that. You have another tip here, which is much bigger and a little bit sort of softer to press on. So this is a 6. From the 6, we look at the Fudegokochi pens. This is the 1, as you can see here, and this is the 4. And the 1 is the extra fine. It's a little bit more rigid. So there is a way to test these. Test them vertically, test them on the side with no pressure, and then test them with a little bit of pressure. That's quite a big spread. And then this is the fine, so that's the extra fine, and this is the fine. As you can see, hairline, hairline, no pressure, no pressure, pressure, which works out roughly to the same size, and a little bit more pressure gives us a thicker stroke. So these have a really great tip. I mean, they're so beautiful to write with. You can stay on the tip if you like, with no pressure, or you can add just a little bit of pressure to get a little bit of pressure and release here. Notice I'm also using speed as well. So let's do the same letter. Such a lovely pen. 1. So the fine gives us obviously more weight than the extra fine. You just have to be a little bit careful if you're working on the tip. So lovely, these pens. And they're great for pressure and release on Western letter forms. So in size, we have lots of different tips here. So let's look at the brushables. So this is a larger tip, and I'm going to just sort of play with this a little bit. So this gives us a line that is either that size, that. Notice I'm tilting my arm downward to get a bigger stroke, rather than pressing. Equally with these brushables, you have a light color on one side and a darker color on the other side. So you can go in and add a highlight or a shadow depending on where you put the line. The Art and Graphic Twin is sort of the same kind of tip, but it's a little bit softer. So let's look at those two together rather than having you to hold that in your mind. So if we look at the two tips, we can see that they're very similar in the way they look, but this one, the Brushables one, is more rigid and bends. The whole tip bends, whereas the Art and Graphic Twin the tip sort of springs. So we have two very distinct starting and ending terminal, sort of the terminal and the beginning point are very, very distinct. You can also work on the tip, which is softer. So you can press, release, and press. Or you can press a little bit harder, or by flattening the tool, you get the full spread. Sorry about that. It's back in here. You can go back here, and you can go back here. These arts and graphic twins also have a rigid fibrous marker on the other side, so you can't really press on this. It's really for monoline work. Now let's look at the front tip of the 55. So remember, the back tip is really thin and hard and is really good for tiny lettering. I love this pen. It's a really, really great tool. The brush tip is a little bit more difficult to manage. Remember, testing, stay on the tip to see what your hairlines are. Tilt and tilt and tilt, and then stay on the tip, and then press a little bit more, and press a little bit more, and press more. Very, very spongy, springy tip. Has a really, really good responsiveness. A little bit more advanced to work with. And of course, you have a really nice, fine nib to work with on the other side. Really, really lovely tool. Next, we have the Fudiburis. So the metallic Fudiburis are pigmented and they're colorful. So I'm going to grab some black paper to show that to you. And I mean, these colors are so bright. Keep them closed. And they have a really responsive tip. So you can press, less pressure, even less pressure, still less pressure. So by going from the flat to the vertical, you can change the amount of deposition. You can also, so let's take this line and apply a little bit of pressure to it. So just be careful. I tend to prefer not to apply too much pressure to the tools because it can be a little bit destructive on the tips. And it's really the tips that you want. So those are the metallic colors. And in that range, we also have these Fudiburi pens. So they're the same tip. Notice I've gone from here to here. So they're the same tip. And even lighter still. They move really beautifully. Both if you take your time and if you have a fast movement. With the Bemojis, we have the extra fine. Just grab a piece of paper there, which produces a nice fine line on its side, but an even finer line on its tip. We have the fine, which again on its side produces a thicker line than the extra fine, but on its tip is still quite fine. We have the medium, which on its side produces a thicker line than the fine and the extra fine, and on its tip a correspondingly thicker line. Now, because of the shape of the tip, we can also apply a little bit of pressure. So we get a bigger letter. And I'm not on the tip, I'm just on the side of the tip. Just to give us a little bit of variation in the weight as we go from extra fine to medium and to large. So the large is on its side, and you can see the relationship of the lines here for the mediums. So these are both done with the medium, and on its tip, and if we press on the tip, what we get is and on the side of the tip, this is a really, really great range of pens. It's a really good set. And in this set, we also have a bristled tip. Now, this bristled tip allows us a lot more variation on its side. Notice I'm moving my arm around to produce these side movements. On the tip, we have a little bit more of a complex brush to work because you can use it vertically to mimic a pointed flexible nib. But again, be careful of not spreading it wider than the base of the brush.